Good morning. I'm Mary Augusta Thomas, and I'm the Deputy Director of Libraries. I'd like to welcome you to the Smithsonian Institution Libraries, the Smithsonian Institution Archives, and the Chief Information Officer's lecture series on the future of what all of us do in the communications and information business, and all of us have some role in that. We started this series about 8 or 9 lectures ago as part of our celebration of our 40th year in existence, our 40th anniversary as an official Smithsonian Institution Libraries, because we thought the good way to celebrate the 40 that we had was to look ahead, not to look past. And boy, have we been looking ahead ever since with the help of our partners in this series. So I'm very glad that you've joined us this morning. I think for the record, we should note there are some very hardy souls here who have come out in the cold weather and joined us in the auditorium, and we're hoping there are any number of you following us at your desk. I am going to be introducing Michael Edson, who is the director of, I'm going to read and Michael will be introducing our speaker, Raine, but I just again wanted to welcome you all here and hope I'm sure we'll have a lively morning, and we've had a good turnout, and I look forward to hearing our speaker, Raine. Oh, I'm sorry. And I forgot the ever-present warning. If you're holding a BlackBerry or you have your phone, it has to be off, not even to still, just totally off. Otherwise, we'll have quite a bit of interference.
Interference. Nobody wants interference. Thank you very much. I am Michael Edson, Director of Web and New Media Strategy at the Smithsonian. I'm the unlucky guy who's in between you and Raine. Lee is the director of the Pew Internet and American Life Project, a nonprofit, nonpartisan fact tank. Did you make that up, Lee? It's a fact tank. I love that. That studies the social impact of the internet. But that simple description really masks the sophistication and sensitivity and impact of the work that Lee and his colleagues do, where most of us, well, I'll say me, I personally tend to act on instinct and some sort of impression about what's going on with technology and the American public. Lee and his team actually work every day to go out and figure it out, day in, day out, week in, week out. And through that work, they've built a platform of insight and understanding that lets all of us actually do our jobs in a better and more faithful way. Most of us think of Lee and his colleagues as friends of the Smithsonian. Lee was a participant in the Smithsonian 2.0 conference last year. He's helped me personally work on Smithsonian strategy and build the ideas that are now taking form as the notional Smithsonian Commons. Lee's co-authored several books based on Pew Internet and American Life Project research. He's currently collaborating with sociologist Barry Wellman on a new title, Networked, the New Social Operating System. This is about cell phones, the internet, and it's being written for MIT Press. Lee, let her rip.
One of the reasons that I love my job is that I get cold emails and cold phone calls from people like Michael and Marcia Adams, who originally approached me to do this. They just flow over the transom, and it's a wonderful thing to behold. And the reason that it matters to Pew is because we self-define as a fact tank. Think tanks, which are plentiful in this town, are in the business of thinking up new policy ideas and then being entrepreneurial about them. So they have agendas that are baked into their DNA. In our case, we have no agenda. A condition of the funding I get from the Pew Charitable Trust is that we not advocate for anything. They don't have a 10-point fix-it plan for the internet. They don't want us to endorse policies or technologies or companies or people. And so it's kind of an interesting mission to have, to just essentially essentially go out in the world and sow enlightenment. We're not supposed to move the needle in any one direction or another, but we're supposed to be useful to people like you. And so when we get invited to places like this and you're interested in Pew Internet data, it's a wonderful and gratifying thing, because it means that we're serving the mission that our funders have laid out for us. Today I'm going to be talking about how to survive in the new media ecology, but I always begin my talks with an apology. I'm from New York. I grew up as a child of New York culture, and I came down to Washington in the late 1970s. And the merger of those two cultures makes me a horrible beast to confront in public speaking forums. I talk really fast, and I've got a lot of data in my head, and I've learned the sort of art of filibuster a lot. And I learned the dangers of this when I was speaking to some librarians in Pennsylvania. And after my talk, a wonderful head of the library system at Penn State came up to me and said, "Mr. Raine, I know what your next job can be." I said, "Ma'am, I'm an aging baby boomer. I don't want a next job." But she said, "Nevertheless, what you can be is the disclaimer reader on drug ads." So that's my apology at first. If I go way too fast, especially for people in the web audience, somehow signal that to slow down or cut me off or something like that. I also have a confession to make. In the earliest proposal that I wrote for the Pew Charitable Trusts, one of the things that I had to block out for them in the grant idea was who might be stakeholders of our work. Where might our work find an audience, particularly in this environment where we're not supposed to promote anything. We're just supposed to, be Joe Friday, just the facts. And so I listed journalists and policymakers and people maybe in the health community, because we've done a lot of research about how people use the internet for health. Didn't mention the word library or librarian, didn't mention the word museum or people who work for museums. We did our first survey in March of 2000, issued our findings in May of 2000, and learned at that moment that some of the primary stakeholders for our work could be librarians and people connected to museums. And now my atonement for that sin is that I've applied for 3 other grants to Pew since then, and you guys are at the top of the list. So I hope you'll forgive me on that. So is there anybody, well, you've been told to shut off your BlackBerries, but is anybody tweeting this now? Michael? Okay, there are some folks, and you know the hashtag. For those of you that don't know Twitter, I'll give you a real simple primer on it. It's a system where in 140 characters or less, you answer the question, what's happening, or what are you doing now? And so yesterday, I tweeted, I'm preparing my talk for the wonderful folks at the Smithsonian tomorrow. And it went out to my 1,182 followers on Twitter. I'm like a Z-level celebrity on Twitter. There are a lot more. Actually, the Smithsonian Library has more followers than I do, and so that's a great thing. The other sort of new thing that they've added to Twitter is they've allowed people to create lists of folks who are sort of related and therefore interesting in connected ways and stuff like that. And we've begun to show up, or I've begun to show up on 91 lists. And some of you apply labels to the list, right? And so one of the labels was webbish. And again, this New York angle of my life, that's perilously close to the Yiddish nebbish, which is not something that I'd want to do. But then I've been on a list called Smart People, excellent, and really interesting. So I thought this list feature has some value to it. So here we are, and we can actually go and see how we're doing already in the Twitter sphere. Oh, end user agreement. I accept. Okay. I did. I'm a. Uh-oh. I might even have to sign in again. Oh, no, here we are. So let's go down and look at our hashtag and see if anybody has tweeted already about me from their desks, or Lee at SI09. I'm searching for it. And look, there we are. And there I am, look. And my staff is already following me on this, which is being stalked by your staff is a sort of strange thing. And in my follower list, I noticed that just before this event began, Mike himself decided, someone in here is also following me. And so I'm going to follow Mike now. So Mike Edson and I are sort of buddies and connected. So that's how we're doing in the Twitter sphere. And just to show you how disorienting it is to be tweeted live, I've been tweeted by librarians. One guy in Iowa said, Lee Raine of Pew Internet reminds me of Johnny Carson for some reason. Now, I thought that was great if it meant that I was funny. It was not so great if I reminded him of a dead person. Then I got at a public broadcaster conference. A guy tweeted he wasn't going to be there, but he was going to miss seeing digital research king Lee Raine, to which another librarian responded, awesome, he's totally king of social media. So those of you who are Twittering can find new worlds for me to conquer. I've also been had my Lord Benson moment in the Twitter sphere. I was speaking to a marketing group, and in the background somebody was tweeting about a white paper from eVantage and gave the URL, which is a common thing in Twitter. You cite the works that you're reading or the websites you're going to and give a link to them so that people can go to them. And somebody tweeted back to him, well, you're no Lee Raine, but you'll do. I also was tweeted in Dutch. And I spoke to the Computers and Libraries Conference last spring. Lee Raine, Director Pew Internet, Ugeling Fukenjing Uwe Worden, each en een zin in 8 minuut, weet ut te spreken. I had no idea what that was. So what do when someone's writing about something in a language you don't know? You put it into Babelfish. Lee Raine, Director Pew Internet, incredibly how many words he, in a sense, and a minute, weet to pronounce. So they're complaining about my pace of speech, even in Dutch. And the final Twitter moment I will have is the Chronicle of Higher Education wrote a horrible piece a couple of weeks ago that talked about how now it's common at conferences and meetings for people to be tweeted, and tweckling is a new phenomenon. It's a transitive verb to abuse a speaker only to Twitter followers in the audience while she is speaking. And the examples they gave in this piece were, these are real tweets. We need a T-shirt, I survived the keynote disaster of '09. It's awesome in the I don't want to turn away from the accident because I might see a severed head way. And finally, too bad they took my utensils away with my plate. I could have jammed the butter knife into my temple. So please don't tweckle me, or if you do, don't laugh too loudly when you get these tweets from stuff. So here we are. There's a big change that's occurred in our lives. We've moved from what I call the industrial media age to the internet media age. In the industrial age, information was scarce, expensive, institutionally oriented, and designed for consumption. It took a lot of people in places earning a decent amount of money to gather up the things they needed, sort it out, make sense of it, and use it to tell stories. That world has turned on its head in the internet era because information is much more abundant, cheap, personally oriented, and designed for participation. People can now do things on their own that they could never do before with information in media, thanks to these new tools. And the single big change that the internet has introduced to this media ecology is that it has taken people who used to be consumers, people who were formerly known as the audience, and put them directly in the picture of interaction with themselves, with other people, and with those large companies that are still in the business, and large organizations like yours that are still in the business of thinking about information, how to display it, how to render it. It's a much more participatory environment, and it's that way because these tools enable participation at a scale that's never been known before. The internet was the asteroid that changed the world from the industrial age to the internet age. These are just sort of the simple data that we've collected in the life of the project. We got our first grant in late '99, actually 10 years ago this month, did our first survey, as I said, in March, first release in May. We found at that time 46% of American adults were using the internet. At the same time, we did a separate survey of teenagers. 73% of those ages 12 to 17 were using the internet. We didn't even ask a broadband question, but I stuck 5% in that slide just because I know a number of people had expense accounts and could afford it at home, but that's what it amounted to. It was a costly thing to have a high-speed connection at home. Everybody who was using the internet at that point really was a dial-up user. About half the country had cell phones. We didn't ask a wireless question, and I think the answer is 0 for that moment. No one connected to the internet wirelessly. And we didn't ask a cloud computing function. Cloud computing essentially means that your stuff is out there on somebody else's servers. It's not housed on the thing that you carry around with you, were the thing that sits on your desk. And at that time, there were webmail accounts. There was Hotmail, and there was Yahoo Mail, and stuff like that. So there were some people who had their material stored online, but it was a relatively small number, and we weren't smart enough even to be asking about it then, because we didn't understand how the world would change so dramatically in the next decade. So the world that we entered, and the world we first started to chronicle, was slow stationary connections built around my computer. Scroll forward 10 years, and the story is radically different. 79% of adults use the internet. 93% of teenagers in that 12 to 17 bracket use it. Close to two-thirds of Americans have broadband at home. These are April data. I think it probably is dead on two-thirds of Americans have broadband at home. The significance of that hardly can be overstated, because when people moved from a dial-up environment to a broadband environment, they became radically different internet users. The internet had moved from being a sort of fun little sidelight or novelty in their life to becoming a central information and communications utility in their life. They built it into the rhythms of their life, and they built it into the expectations that they had about information and media in ways that they never did in the dial-up era, so that the normal experience, the norm of experience in the internet now is a broadband norm. It's not great. We're not doing as well as some other countries, but still in all, it's a very different environment from the one we first started measuring. 85% of American adults have cell phones. More than half of people now connect to the internet wirelessly, and we measure that two ways. First of all, they connect wirelessly through wireless cards or in their laptops, and about 40% of Americans do that. But another batch of folks, is about a third of Americans connect to the internet through these things that they carry around in their pockets, and that used to be called cell phones, but are now computing devices that happen to do phone calling as well as innumerable other things. And that wireless connectivity, again, sort of changes people's mindsets about how they relate to others in their lives and how they relate to information. All of a sudden, it's with them everywhere. It's part of their clothing. It's even, I saw a quote the other day, it's part of their skin. They can access the things that they want and the people they want whenever the spirit moves them, as long as they've got the device attached to them. And it's particularly important because two-thirds of Americans, more than two-thirds really, use cloud computing functions. If you use a social networking site, how many people here have Facebook or MySpace accounts? Yeah, pretty much everybody. You're a cloud computer. You're using cloud computing to do that because it's not housed here, it's housed out there. That's where you store your pictures, that's where you embed your videos, that's where you're telling the story of your life. Blogging is essentially wall posting, and so those of you who post on your walls, I would call you bloggers now. But it's out there, as well as other services and functions where you can store videos and pictures and files and stuff like that. And of course, the power of cloud computing makes the power of these portable devices even greater, because you can get your stuff wherever you are, and you can access the people that you care about and the services and applications that you care about, again, from wherever you are. So the environment has moved from that slow stationary environment to fast mobile connections built around outside servers and outside storage. Another way to sort of see the change in the media ecology is to look at the media ecology of a typical American home. There were some products that got there in the let's call this the mid-70s. There were some products that got there, a couple of ways they got to the home, a couple of ways they were displayed once they got there, and we even stored them every once in a while so we could re-experience them if we cared to. That's what it looks like now, but that's even a sort of poor version of what the reality is, because there are so many more individual TV stations. There are so many more, millions upon millions of websites. And so the environment is really becoming sort of ubiquitous gadgetry and access to stuff. And here's the data that's the most current data that we have. 47% of Americans own laptops. Percent have MP3 players, about a third have game consoles, and about a fifth have personal gaming devices that are internet connected. So again, the gadgetry that is now commonplace in American households and with individuals has moved this environment into their personhood, and that changes the way that people think about what they can do and how they can do it. that's the sort of data dump part of my show. So if you're still with me, that's already a good thing. But it might be worthwhile just to stop right now, certainly for people in the audience here. Do you have questions about the numbers I've just run through really quickly? Yes?
Is there a gender gap?
Is there a gender gap?
Yeah, women, men.
Yeah, there is not. It's a great question. There is not a gender gap anymore. It basically, women reached parity with men about the year 2000. The very first survey we did, there were actually more women in America using the internet than men, and that's stayed the same. It's generally they stair-step together, but because there are more women in America than men, there are more women now online than men, even though the percentage of use is the same. What was clearly true is that there are differences in the kinds of media experiences that men and women have online. Women, the stereotypes actually have some truth to them. Women are deep-dyed communicators and love the communications functions and the outreach and social network building that the internet can do. Men are more sort of hunters and gatherers. They go out and search for stuff, and once they've killed it, they bring it back in, and they've got it out of the way. And also sort of standard media things that we've seen in media studies way predating the internet also hold up. Men are somewhat more into news, hard news, than women are. Women are much more likely to be healthcare information seekers than men are. So sort of patterns of behavior that are long embedded in these relationships don't go away with the internet. The internet hasn't made us wholly new creatures who have vastly different interests from our pre-internet selves or our pre-internet ancestors, but they're playing out in the internet in sort of interesting ways. There's a really interesting school of thought now about the role and importance of participation online. Not everybody is a participator. About 2/3 of adults and about 3/4 of teenagers do something resembling participation. They post to a public place. They share content that they've created with other people in a variety of ways. And the participation gap in certain functions skews more towards women and in others skews more towards men. And there's Henry Jenkins at the University of Southern California in the Annenberg School has spent a lot of time thinking about the deficits that people have if they don't have sort of a new cluster of literacies about how to use these technologies and how to understand where you are when you're using these technologies. And so I would commend his work to you. A lot of it has been funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and it's really wonderful, rich work. So there are lots of gaps that play out. There's still obviously economic gaps in internet use and broadband use. Race is no longer an independent predictor of internet or broadband use. People who are similarly situated, whites and blacks, have pretty much the same internet profiles, or at least access profiles and gadgetry profiles. Ruralness is still a separate independent predictor of broadband use. Disabilities is still a powerful independent predictor. If you're disabled, you are much less likely to be an internet user than not. Language proficiency is a big drawback. If you prefer to speak Spanish, we do our survey work occasionally in Spanish, so we offer that alternative to people. And those who really prefer to take our surveys in Spanish are less likely to be online than those who feel comfortable with English. And educational attainment is also, as in all social science, a powerful predictor. If you've got a lot of education, you are a very different person from someone who has less formal education, and that plays out online in sort of obvious ways. Any other questions about that? Okay. So the sort of guts I wanted to talk about today are the 10 ways this ecosystem has changed and how it might play out in the lives that you care to intersect with. Number one, the sort of primary change that I think is easy for all of us to understand is that the volume of information has grown. A wonderful proprietary or commercial technology measuring firm, IDC, has talked about the probability that the amount of digital data that exists now will double by 2014, 2015. So, think of all the millennia heading up to, the year 1900 when the 20th century itself was an era where more information was created than in any period preceding it added up. And now we've gone to a position where we are going to double the digital information, and so much more information, of course, is being digitized to begin with, that we are now in exponential levels of growth that have real consequences for the way that people operate in this world. There's a lot of stuff to master, or there's a lot of stuff being generated, and I think people are frustrated that they can't necessarily master it. And I've highlighted some authors here who have addressed some of the issues related to that, if you care to dig into any of these. Particularly, Chris Anderson has written a number of books, but in the context of the volume of information growing, his book about the long tail is really important. He talks about the sort of, over time, there's lots more information. If you look at a power curve, and it goes down, hits and best-selling books and record sales and all sorts of stuff are at the top of it, and then it levels off at the bottom of the curve and just goes on infinitely. Well, all of a sudden, the long tail becomes a lot more important and a lot more interesting to people when they can find stuff there. It's not necessarily that the amount of traffic that it gets or the amount of attention that it gets necessarily grows very much, but that people who really want to find that stuff now have tools to get to it that are important and meaningful and powerful to get them to the things that they want. So the long tail's power grows. Hal Varian is an economist at Berkeley and now the chief economist at Google, who has documented growth in the early 2000s that matches the growth that IDC was talking about. Change is that the variety of information and sources of information grow. There is a lot of concern about the people's coping mechanisms in this environment, whether they are sort of customizing their information universe and their social universe only to be dealing with people and information like them, or information that sort of confirms their belief system or matches their political views or affirms their lifestyle or one thing or another. A lot of that's going on. Human nature is to seek out stuff that's compatible with the way you see the world. That's not anything new. But one of the most striking things that's happened is that people have got a lot more alternatives now for finding the information and sources and people who match up with their lives. And so we're seeing a lot more niches growing up in groupings, in communities, in interests of one kind or another. And what we see with the heaviest technology users is the opposite of that cocooning effect. We see the people who have a lot of gadgets and who are the most power-crazed internet users actually bump into stuff that doesn't match their worldview and wasn't part of their purposeful search and things. So this explosion of variety of information is actually diversifying the information sources and information available to people if they want to take advantage of it. If they don't, they're more likely to be cocooning, but a significant portion of people, particularly as they become more used to the technology, are actually finding new stuff in new ways, which is a really good thing for you guys. The velocity of information increases and smart mobs emerge. And Marshall McLuhan codified the brilliant notion that in the age of mass media, of radio, especially of TV, we lived in a global village. That's not anything new. That was a place where we lived in 1960, at least in the sense that much of humanity learned about big events and sort of big things that were happening pretty much simultaneously. So we were already in an environment where those sort of large stories splayed out into the universe quickly. What is mattered about the internet universe is little ways in which the speed of information has picked up. Think about your own life and the ways that the things that you're interested in, the hobbies, the work-related things, the friends and stuff like that. You have new tools available to you now to figure out and learn about anything new in the things that matter to you almost the instant that they occur, or that you will be notified through your social network, through viral communications. So it's not necessarily the big stuff that's speeded up in our lives, but it's the small stuff and the way that we can arrange our lives to gather up information about the things that matter to us, the passions that we have, the world that we want to arrange. Smart mobs is the wonderful notion that came from a book book by a sociologist named Howard Rheingold. And he talked about how people are now have the capacity to self-organize without command and control communities telling them where to go and how to get stuff. And he had tons of examples about how people didn't necessarily need large bureaucracies to tell them where to go. This is a wonderful picture from a square in Belarus. And it's a great example of a smart mob because the government there doesn't like a lot of thought of political opposition. They have literally banned opposition groups from forming, and they need to sanction the groups that do form and stuff like that. So the kids there, armed with their cell phones, basically said, we don't necessarily want to play by those rules, and have decided that on a certain day of the week, I think this is a Thursday or a Friday, but at the appointed hour, they text each other or they phone each other and say, we're going to the square, and they all order ice cream. So getting an ice cream cone in a Belarusian square is a political act in that community where people are essentially on the fly forming up groups and sort of saying, we're going to be what we want to be without necessarily seeking your approval for it. There are tons of ways that smart mobbing plays out in other ways in your life. Think about groups that have formed spontaneously around needs that you have, or the way that you've responded to needs that other people have expressed. That's smart mobbing too. Clay Shirky is a fabulous author who talked to the Web 2.0, the Smithsonian 2.0 conference here about his book, Here Comes Everybody, which essentially says all these tools are in people's hands, and they're going to use them aggressively for the things that matter to them and the way and the networking that matters to them, and that's smart mobbing as well. Ecosystem change 4 is that venues of intersection with information and people multiply, and the availability of information expands to all hours of the day and all places. The Nielsen Company is sort of the most authoritative source on this. People are now operating in an environment where they are playing their own playlists, and they are accessing media at the times that matter to them rather than the industrial age media phenomenon of us going to appointment media. If you weren't in front of a TV at 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night, you missed the national news. It just wasn't there for you after that. If you didn't have, your TV on at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night in the 80s, you didn't get to watch The Cosby Show, right? Well, nowadays, with all these devices that capture and store and allow us to display information, people are time shifting their experiences of media, and they're place shifting. They are watching TV on their iPod videos as they're riding the bus or the metro to work, and that has changed the way that people think about their control of media and their experiences of media. Ecosystem change number 5 is that people's vigilance for information has changed in both directions. Am I doing okay? Oh, okay. Okay. The first way to talk about is attention is truncated. We all know about multitasking, right? Everybody's a multitasker, and we all sort of wring our hands about teenagers and stuff like that. There's actually a smarter notion about this that has been promoted by a friend of mine named Linda Stone, who's a technology consultant. She worked for Apple and Microsoft and stuff like that. She talks about all of us living our lives in a state of continuous partial attention, where if you think about it, you've got all your devices on. You've got your cell phone on. You've got your email client on. You might have your instant message client. You might have all sorts of ways that you are soliciting or at least open to input from the outside world, right? And you dare not turn any of those devices off because something important might come in, or you might miss something, right? And Linda worries that this creates lots more stress in people's lives, that they, in part because they're interruptible all the time in every place that they are, that this just, means that we can't complete tasks as thoroughly as possible, as quickly as we might have if we could devote sort of full attention to them and stuff like that. But it's sort of a condition of life that we are living almost like a phased array radar. We're scanning the environment for new inputs from the boss, from our family, from our friends and stuff like that. And it's a different sort of approach to attention and different lifestyle of attention than we had before. But at the same time as attention is becoming truncated, these new tools have given people the power to dig much more deeply into the subjects that they really care about. And so attention has become elongated. And there are actually 2 flavors of this as well. Andrew Keen is a sort of curmudgeonly young guy who says, this is not a good world. The cult of the amateur is giving power to knuckleheads, basically. If anybody can throw up a blog, or anybody can create a Facebook page, or anybody can do something online that looks halfway credible, we've cut out some very important traditional systems of information assessment and verification and fact-checking and all of the editing functions that went into all kinds of media. And we're losing stuff as a culture because now it's harder to sort through all the bad stuff to get to all the good stuff. And even some of the pressures that these media place on traditional media sources are breaking down some of the old functions of editing and breaking down some of the fact-checking processes and stuff. He thinks this is just bad news from start to finish. There's an alternative theory put out by Terry Fisher, who's one of the heads of the Berkman Center for the Internet and Society at Harvard, who says this is the age of the golden flowering of amateur experts. And the wonderful things can come when people themselves are empowered to gather up the information that matters to them and to become, in some ways, as expert on certain subjects as the people who have the credentials and have the skills and training that our society says are important for expertise. A classic example that we see in our work is the way people do health searches. Now, if yesterday you didn't care about a lot of health conditions or what kind of information might be out there available, you're diagnosed today, you want to be an expert on that problem in the next 20 minutes. And the Internet and all the tools that are a part of it allow people to get up to speed on the subject that they care about, not just health information, but particularly powerfully in health information in dramatic ways. And it's really reversed, or certainly changed, the relationship that people have with their doctors. You know, the all-knowing, omnipotent, I'll listen to you for 5 minutes and then I'll tell you in 3 minutes what you need to do for you doctor has given way to a co-decision maker with patients who very often are walking into the doctor's office with stacks of web printouts saying, why didn't you tell me about these side effects of the medication you were asking me to take? Or why didn't you tell me about this other hospital or this other service that I could get? Or what about this alternative diagnosis that I see from my searches and stuff like that? Older doctors are very disoriented by this, and actually younger doctors now are coming to terms with it and are actually thinking that information therapy or information advice is as much a part of their interactions with patients as actual diagnosis and treatment recommendations. So, I mean, the jury's out on this, and we can't get to the bottom of it in the kind of research we do, but the large story about how people allocate their time, and even more particularly how they allocate their attention, is radically different from the way that it was in the industrial media era. Why don't I just stop there for filibuster pause? I've done 5 of my 10. Are there other questions about? Yeah.
A couple things. First of all, the word amateur means lover of. And so perhaps in this new world we should look at that definition. That's the way it was in the 19th century. It became sort of a negative in the 20th century. Maybe we should be looking at redefining that again.
For those who are listening, it's a lovely point. The word amateur actually derives from words meaning to love something. And in the pre-20th century, the way that we thought about amateurs were that they had contributions to make, and they had every right and privilege to gather up information the way they wanted to.
And the second thing I wanted to say is, with all the things that you're saying, what we need, and coming from education in my first career, is to be able to teach participatory literacy. In other words, how to be a good participant. When there are no heads, head of the, I'm not leading this, when there are no leaders,
right.
When we're all leaders. And that's not really happening.
The second point, just for those who are listening and not here, is that there's an interest and concern about participatory literacy, that there's a new skill set and a new set of sensibilities. Really, sometimes people phrase this as a question about ethics. How do you behave ethically in an environment like this when you can be as unethical as you care to be? That these might be important new dimensions of literacy that we should pay more attention to, and they aren't being talked about in schools. I'm with you. Everything you said said sounds exactly right. This is exactly what people like Henry Jenkins are beginning to think about, and it's the ethics of it and the sort of personal dimensions of it are pretty interesting. Just managing your reputation in this environment is a wholly different thing than it was in a place where maybe you wrote little handwritten notes to your classmate and passed them, and 3 people learned about stuff. Well, now that can go viral pretty quickly under the wrong circumstances. And so thinking about different audiences and the context of your initial exchange being only one place where the context has to be assessed. What do you do when it leaps the shark and goes to a different audience and gets out to a wider audience? But those are lovely points. Yes?
Let me make one additional point about this. In the science area, and recently in a National Research Council study, we abandoned the word amateur for exactly the reason brought up.
Lovely.
But we recognize what we now call citizen scientists in the new environment can contribute significant information to us. The difference is citizen scientists are people who want to participate in the culture of science and follow the rules and standards of the culture of science, which are things like peer review and so forth like that.
Right. I'm not going to repeat it all, but it's a lovely thought about how some scientific groups now have abandoned the notion of amateurs and have embraced a sort of more encompassing notion of citizen scientists who participate and embrace the ethics and practices of the scientific community and very much want to be part of it and are now empowered in these ways. This is a lovely point. There was another thought? Okay. Ecosystem change 6 is that the vibrance and immersive qualities of media environments are changing. And there was a wonderful project called the Metaverse Roadmap Project that began to map this out in 2007. If you do a search on Metaverse Roadmap, you'll get to the work that they did. And they talked about 4 dimensions of how, in this new information ecology, the merger of virtual information and media and real life stuff that's going on is taking place in these 4 realms. First, they talked about virtual worlds. Second Life, some of the gaming environments are very much this. They are not of this world. They are not meant to be of this world. They have participants from this world. And over time, the gaming environment is becoming pretty darn compelling. When we did work looking at teenagers in gaming, we found that 97% of teenagers have participated in computer gaming of one kind or another, or console gaming or online gaming and stuff like that. It is not just the province of 14-year-old boys in their sweatpants killing everything in sight. Some of that's going on, for sure, but there's a lot more social activity. In some gaming environments, there are more women than men, more girls than boys, who are participating in role-playing games, board games, all sorts of strategy games and stuff like that. So it's a rich social environment that will only get richer as computing power improves, as bandwidth improves as well, and as our storage capacity and even the screens themselves become a lot more immersive. The second way they talked about it was virtual worlds, which are meant to be representations of the world that we live in. Google Earth is a sort of iconic way that people think about it, where you can pack more information into stuff because you know about it geographically. I don't know whether you might have heard that earlier this week, Google announced that it was unveiling a thing called Google Goggles that would go on the Android operating system phones that Google is now putting out. So this is a cell phone device. You can use the camera function in that device to take a picture of a building, of a landscape, of an artifact of one kind, and then a Google search will begin to tell you about what that is, when the building was built, what the health records of that building are, what people live and work in that building, all sorts of records about it, and it has face recognition as part of it too. So Google, in collecting all these images that it's it's collected over time, is now beginning to develop the capacity to recognize people. If you take a picture of Mike Edson as he's walking down the street, there's not going to be a day too long from now when your phone will tell you, that's Mike Edson, and he works at the Smithsonian, and he's the cool digital strategy guy that's there, and he's building the digital commons and stuff like that. And it's the privacy implications of this are enormous. The social implications are enormous, but it's these mirror worlds have got power, and it's partly because of this third thing, augmented reality. We are now being able, because of particularly GPS devices and chips put in our phones, we can now sort of see much more about the world than just what our eyes can see about it. We can get data displays of all kinds, depending on the databases that are available in these things. And that's of the four things they've cited, that's probably the most immediate and powerful change that's on the way. And the fourth thing they talked about was life logging. In the social networking environment, but also in a lot of other ways, people are just shedding lots of data and disclosing lots of things about themselves, sometimes purposefully, other times without even being aware of it. But our lives now, we're building up pretty big digital dossiers about ourselves, and this is a reality that will only get more powerful as databases are combined and as people are allowed to share and collect more data than ever. So that's a set of things to think about for the future of this ecology. Digital learning ecosystem change 7 is that the valence or relevance of information improves. We are now in an environment where we can't perfectly customize what comes into our life, but we're a lot closer than we were when a wonderful theorist, Nicholas Negroponte, who used to run the MIT Media Labs, wrote a book called Born Digital, and it talked about the emerging world where we can create the daily me. Instead of the newspaper that comes to you or the news broadcast that comes to you with somebody else deciding what's relevant and interesting and important for you to know, you can arrange your life with these very powerful tools to gather up the things that matter most to you through listservs that are group activities that often provide information about the velocity of information about the things that matter to the group. Obviously, there are ways that you can customize web pages. I'm totally into the vanity thing, so I've got all sorts of ways that I learn every minute of the day what's being said about pure internet and on the internet and places like that. It also allows us to create the daily us. It allows us to create group situations and communities built around the data that we care about. The ecosystem change 8 is the voice of information democratizes and the visibility of new creators is enhanced. Again, about 2/3 of adults are content creators, 3/4 of teenagers are content creators, and they're a lot more findable now. Even if they're not necessarily getting a lot of traffic, the search engines are good enough and the social search strategies are good enough so that a lot more people are participating by pitching their voice, pitching their ideas, pitching their stories into our culture, and they're findable in ways that they didn't used to be because search tools that we have are much more powerful. My favorite thinker on this subject is William Dutton, Bill Dutton at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is sort of an English, it's not quite like Pew Internet, but it's a wonderful research organization housed at Oxford. He talks about the content creator class, many of them using social media and social networking activities, as comprising the fifth estate of culture. Remember in the old French regimes there were 3 estates. It was the clergy, it was the nobility, and it was the citizens, right? And then in the 19th century, as the print press in particular became a prominent sort of separate civic venue and with a separate set of sensibilities and a separate way of seeing the world, the idea of the fourth estate, signifying the press, was codified first in England and then in the United States. Dutton argues that, and he's got data, and it absolutely maps with data that we're gathering on American Pew Internet, that social media creators, content creators of all kinds, have a somewhat different approach to the world than those who don't. There's that participation angle again, that they for sure have different news values from traditional news values. My colleagues across the hall at the Pew Research Center, this Project for Excellence in Journalism, puts out 2 studies every week based on their content analysis of what's covered in the mainstream media. That usually comes out at the beginning of the week, and they look at the previous week and what were the major stories, and they analyze more than 50 sources, but all kinds: newspapers, TV stations, internet sources, and radio and magazines. And then later in the week, they put out what they call the social media index, which they've been doing since the beginning of this year. And they use a variety of online tools to figure out what are the most linked to stories in the social media environment. And oftentimes, these 2 worlds, the mainstream media world and the social media world, are thinking about focusing on and talking about different things. And so this notion that Dutton has, that those who are participants in this new participatory culture just have a different sense of what these tools can do and a different sense of what's important and what's meaningful. And it goes in interesting directions, too. The social media creators are obviously tech-obsessed, and they're applications-obsessed. They use this stuff, so they always love to hear about blogging. They're berserk about any reference to Twitter and stuff like that. They love sort of the fun new videos that are posted on YouTube and things like that. So they're really into tech, but and so in that realm, they're often the originators of news. Before the mainstream media get to it, the social media sphere sometimes is already all over a story. But the other way that they have a different sensibility in many cases is that they keep a story alive for a lot longer. And, once the mainstream media sort of covers it until the facts are over, until some sort of resolution might have taken place, or just until they've lost interest or another big story overtakes it, there's a pretty short lifespan to any particular piece of news unless it's cataclysmic, right? In the social media sphere, they keep talking about it, and they keep linking to it, and there's more stuff. And oftentimes there are people in the blogosphere and other places who hunt down new facts or to go to original primary sources and stuff. And that creates new links and new things in the social media sphere that sort of keep the story alive. So in some sense, it's an early warning system for some kind of news, and in other senses, it's prolonging the story because people still want to keep talking about it with these new tools. So it's a very different world, and that's why I like Dutton's notion that it can be considered a separate realm. I think that's demonstrably true. Ninth change is that voting and ventilating about information proliferates. People are creating their own sense of meaning. You guys are living this with tagging and other ways that people are commenting on or refereeing sources of information. Henry Jenkins and David Weinberger are my teachers on this. Jenkins I've already described. David Weinberger has a wonderful series of books that essentially have talked about people creating their own taxonomies and what the meaning of that is, and how do you operate in a world where not all metadata are agreed upon. It's brilliant. He's still working it through, and he's now focusing a lot on the role of Wikipedia. But it's certainly an environment where people have the capacity and the yearning to make their own meaning out of the stuff that they are encountering. Well, one of my favorite examples of this culture of comment and this culture of reaction and responding and reputation building is ratemyprofessors.com. Where I have kids who are college-age kids, and they would not think about taking a course at their schools without checking out the professors who are teaching those classes on ratemyprofessors.com. And they absolutely is determinative of what they don't take, and it's a lot of times influencing of what they end up deciding to take. And one of the sort of sad but funny things that they do on this site is they list some of the most interesting posts about professors that have been made, and they're usually pretty nasty. My single favorite one is a posting by a student who took an English course with a Midwestern English professor and said, "This guy is so bad, he taught me to hate my native tongue." That's rough stuff. But it's now a culture where we can talk back. It's not just sitting in a lecture hall and taking it and maybe grumbling to a classmate or two about how it's not helping or it's the boring professor or whatever. It's now out there for people to see, or certainly the tools enable people to see that. And finally, the learning system change, or the ecosystem change 10, is that social networks themselves have become much more vivid. They're not more important. Well, yes, actually they are more important, but they certainly, we can see with these new tools like Facebook and MySpace sort of what social networks are. And this gets me to the book that I'm writing, because the notion that I have bought into from this wonderful sociologist Barry Wellman is that we are now living in an age of networked individualism, where he talks about this being different from the previous world that we lived in. It's more like an 18th century world, so the change has been evolutionary since then. It's not a radical change just brought on by technology. But he talked about a world that most people used to live in, of tight-knit groups in that bygone era, where your family and your very closest friends and maybe a couple of the people that you work with constituted your social network, and they knew everything about you and they knew everything about each other. It was very tight-knit, and it moved along with you, and it was good in certain ways, because you kind of always knew that you had a social safety net. If you ran into trouble, there were at least some people who you would hope would come to your aid, perhaps even without you asking for it. It was not so good because everybody knew your business, right? In the age that we're now entering, or that we are fully in, of networked individualism, things have opened up. We have a lot more people that we deal with, and we deal with them in different ways, and Barry's argument is that we deal with them in the sense of networking as a verb. We actually activate different parts of our network depending on what our needs are and what kind of problems we have to solve or what kind of decisions we have to make. And it's not necessarily the case that parts of our network even know each other, much less share the same expertise and share the same relationship with me. Networked individuals in this new media ecology have a bunch of different attributes than their predecessors. First of all, they have a very different sense of information. Information goes with them. It's ambient, and when they can carry it around in their pocket and access it in all the ways that they can, and all the devices they can use it with. Their sense of time is very different. They live in continuous partial attention, but they also live in this world of the capacity to dive more deeply into the things that really matter to them. Their sense of community and connection is different. A wonderful cultural critic named Kenneth Gergen talked about people, especially in the cell phone era, of living in a life of absent presence. Think about the times when you're talking to somebody or you're with them at a meal or whatever. The phone rings and they go away. They might be sitting there with you, but they are definitely with whoever is in here and not with you. And his notion was that we are interruptible, and that the capacity of people literally to bring their presence into our lives is very different and very powerful. And so the people's sense of community, their sense of the availability of others, their sense of their obligation to others when they need to respond and stuff like that, that's all different. And of course it's a smart mob world. And it's also a world where people's sense of personal efficacy can be operated on in different ways. And again, I go back to the healthcare world, where people, when they have a need, can instantly form a network that responds to their needs. I don't know about you, but I have had a sick friend, and a couple of dozen people will sort of rally to that friend's cause. And some people will take care of carpooling, and some people will take care of meals, and some people in these networks will become sort of the amateur experts. They will be the ones to review the most current medical literature, sometimes bring themselves up to speed on clinical trials that are going on, avail themselves of all of the information on the web about alternative places of treatment, alternative ideas, what the problems might be. Some people take it upon themselves to do a sort of a pre-screen of online patient groups. They can be places where a lot of not necessarily great stuff happens, but there are some powerful patient groups that help people, give information to people about how to live their lives in this condition. And so these networks sort of form up around somebody and their illness, and then sort of dissipate when the situation goes away. But the point I'm making about personal efficacy there is that those groups can form on the fly and be sort of arranged very quickly, but when someone expresses the will to that. And that's the efficacy point. And of course, people's sense of the rewards and challenges of networking for social, economic, and political and cultural purposes have changed. Networks themselves have changed, particularly in the era of these new technologies. Well, I'll go through this. They're bigger. We have more of all kinds of our ties than we used to have, than our ancestors had. And sociologists talk about weak ties and strong ties. There's evidence now that we, more than our parents did, we generally have more people who are really close to us. And who will do important things for us. But we also have a lot more weak ties. We have connections to people who serve important social, political, economic functions for us, but they're out there and accessible in new and different ways, and that means our networks are looser. That we can, if we have a financial problem, we can talk to the people in our network that we think might have expertise related to that. If we have a healthcare problem, we talk to different people. If we have sort of an emotional need or a spiritual crisis in our life, we talk to yet a third group of people. And so it's a different environment where our ancestors were only talking maybe to the same people for all of those kinds of subjects. Those networks are more segmented in the ways I've just described, and they're more layered. It's not necessarily the case. Bear and I are arguing about this, and I'm going to give you my version of the argument, so at least you'll know what I think. I think there's a new layer, or actually several layers added to our social networks. And the outer layer, sort of at the level of Pluto in the solar system, we don't even know whether it's real or not, are our audience. If I look at those 1,800 people in my Twitter account, I don't know two-thirds of them. I literally do not know them. I look at their profiles. I see what they do. I have no idea how I've encountered them. I have no idea what their pathway was to me. Obviously, they're interested in data from the Pew Internet Project, and sometimes they've seen a presentation of mine or something like that. But they are real actors in my social network. They are my audience. We probably wouldn't recognize each other if we passed each other in the street, but here's how they might serve my needs. I mean, this is a real concrete example. We're about to go into the field with a survey about how people encounter the news and use the news in their lives in this new environment. There's a tremendous amount of ferment in the media business, as you know. And if I ping my network, if I did a series of tweets and said, we're writing this survey, what do you want to know about? I know that a portion of those people who didn't know me really, and certainly I didn't know, would respond to me. They give me ideas. They're interested in that subject because they know we study it, and they want to help me. They want to see some question answered in their life. They know a point of connection with me now, and they are willing to answer it. We don't know each other any better after that encounter or not, but that's real social support for me, as well as professional support. That is, intellectual capital that they are sharing with me, and that's a real active part of my network if I want to decide to operate it. In addition, I think that, we're just seeing more tiers. There are certain weak ties that we have that are a lot closer to us than certain other weak ties we have, and I think the market is segmenting more. So the environment we're operating in, we're more liberated than our ancestors were. We can pick and choose who we share stuff with, people that we share stuff with. We don't necessarily have to disclose everything to everyone. And so there's, just like this, the small town person who moves to the city finding, relief from the social observations that are happening in that small town. We're liberated in much the same way, but we also have to work harder. I mean, it's not necessarily only a net plus in our life. In order to get our needs met and in order to be available to other people who also have needs and stuff like that, we just have to do a lot more work. That's why people are feeling so stressed in their life, because they're constantly getting asked or solicited or somehow contacted by the people that they know saying, can you help in this way or another? Can you do this for me? And stuff like that. And we have now many more ways to contact each other. And the final thing to say about the new structure of social networks is that they've become much more important to people in the fundamental sense. In an environment where the volume of information is growing, the velocity is growing, the variety of sources are growing, and all sorts of stuff like that, the standard human coping mechanism with those stressors is to turn back to their networks to help them in the most fundamental ways that we all depend on our networks. At one level, people turn to their networks to find out what's important and meaningful. I mean, essentially, they count on their networks to be their sentries for interesting stuff. We ask a question in one of our surveys the yes answers have grown over time. We say, I don't feel, agree or disagree? I don't feel like I can keep up with the news as much as I used to, but I always I'm sure that I can find out the things that I need to find out because someone will let me know. That's not quite the wording, but that's essentially it. And the number of people who say, I totally agree with that, has gone up because when people know you in their social networks, they are going to alert you. And if they want to have a little exchange with you, yesterday I sent Mike a link to the NEA report on how people are accessing cultural artifacts, and there were a whole bunch of museum-related findings in that big new survey that was released by the National Endowment for the Arts. As to say, Mike, know you care about this? Here it is. You might have seen it in the Washington Post, but just in case you didn't, here it is. And so you have a question, but I just want to finish the point that at one level we depend on our networks to be sentries. The other ways that we depend on our networks now is to assess information. Once it's come into our life, if we're confused about it, we often turn to the smarter people in our networks to say, what do you make of this? Or what do you think I should make of this? And in the final way, our networks are become our audience for deeper participation and deeper sort of displays of what we think about in the world. We have now sort of new ways that we can talk to lots of people about what we've concluded and acted on and the information we gather. There was a question here.
Well, it's more of a statement. What's happening is that when we friend people or when we start following people on Twitter, we're developing a personal filter that will do exactly what you're doing. So we're the ones that are sort of at the center of what you were talking about.
Exactly. It's a great point. We're offering ourselves up and depending on the people that we are following to be filters and editors and in some sense curators. You sometimes remember, oh yeah, what was that study that I was talking about, or what was that event that I went to that I can't, who was that speaker? And if you ping your network, they'll help you figure that out. So the filtering function is enormously important. And there's some wonderful data from the Roper Research Organization that show that since the mid-1980s, more and more people are turning to their networks to make sort of basic everyday life decisions. What to buy, what movies to go to, who to vote for, what recipes are good, all sorts of sometimes prosaic and sometimes profound things in their life. There was a new study out this week from ComScore that has the ring of truth to it. I didn't look at it very carefully, but it said 28% of the gift-giving decisions people are making this holiday season are driven by social network recommendations or preferences or something like that. So that's how we cope in this. Are there other sort of questions about this? Because this is my sort of talk about social networks. So here's the punchline for you guys. And you're already sort of on this pathway, and I'm mostly just sort of affirming that it's the right pathway and hoping to give you more ammunition to use as you see fit. Museums can be nodes in people's social networks. In this era of personal media and social media, and when you're exchanging information with participants, people don't necessarily see you as a friend the way they see others do, but they act like you're a friend. They will turn to you for help in gathering up the information that matters to them. They will turn to you for assessing the information that they've gathered. They'll turn to you for the ways that you can help them navigate to the things they want. Those are the hallmarks of friendship. And it might not be the mindset that you guys have as you're thinking about the work that you want to do, but I would argue that it's not a bad way, framing question for lots of what you do. How can we connect to people's social networks, therefore their needs, with the stuff that we're doing? Obviously, social media tools are enormously powerful ways to do that. But there's punchline number 2. It's people can be nodes in museums, social networks. This is not at all the age where you guys bear the burden of being all things to all people in all ways and being all experts. There are ways that people can make contributions to the things you care about, the science you care about, the other things that you care about. And a sort of wonderful example that I bring from a slightly different realm is from the Library of Congress. Many of you may have known, and it was somewhat referred to and saluted in the Smithsonian 2.0 conference, is the Flickr Commons project. For a long time at the Library of Conference, they've had boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes full of images that they didn't know what to do with. They didn't know how to scan them. They didn't know how to certainly create information related to them. They didn't know how to exploit a treasure that they had. So they finally, after a lot of internal discussion and stuff like that, led by a team by Michelle Springer, said, we're going to take the plunge into this. Flickr is the photo sharing site, and they put up a bunch of photos that were that they didn't know about. Sometimes they had a little bit of information connected to them, but in many cases there was zero information other than the things that you could observe on the screen. So this is one of the several thousand that they initially put up in their first posting in it was either early 2008 or late 2007, and Flickr gave it a little ride, and it was done. And this is one of the pictures they posted up there, and they literally said, we think it's in northeastern Massachusetts, but it might be southeastern Massachusetts. We don't know. It's just out there. Well, people began, just regular old interested citizens began to comment on what was on the pictures. People noticed that the design of the street lamps was a certain way, so that meant that it was the initial thought was this is a picture from the late 1920s maybe. Turns out that these street lamps weren't made until later on in the 1930s, and so someone noticed that. There was a notice about the movie that was highlighted in a poster in this store window, and it turns out to have been a movie that was made in 1940 and released in 1941. Okay, so we've got a little more data here. Oh, somebody noticed the street sign and said, oh, that's got to be a street in Brockton, Massachusetts. And finally, people began to notice the menus on the wall and just sort of figure out what prices were and how they matched up with other things and related to that. And all of a sudden, you could see the material about this artifact just exploding, and people talking about their memories of luncheonettes like this. And about a week or so, or I'm actually not sure of the timing of this, but after a period of time after this was up, comes in this posting from a woman who says her name is Elaine Deos Liatzos. This was her dad's luncheonette. And she could identify the exact street corner that it was on, and exactly when this picture was likely taken in early 1941, just as the movie poster would have indicated. And then she wrote, the whole family at one time or another worked at Sylvia's. My mother Effie, my brother Nick, my sister Dorothea, myself Elaine. Sylvia's is often remembered in the Brockton newspaper as the Enterprise column from our readers as a downtown fixture. People would go there after the movies, catching a bus to and from the surrounding towns to shop in downtown Brockton, and a high school hangout. Salespeople and office workers downtown were regulars for lunch and coffee breaks. And she went on for about 3 screens worth of material about her life in this store and what it changed into, and the person who walked into the store one day to demonstrate a cooker and eventually convinced them that they ought to be serving chicken sandwiches there. I mean, it's just charming, right? And it's all because a community got built around this artifact. And there was a wonderful notion, I wish I'd been smart enough to promote at Smithsonian 2.0, I think it was Clay Shirky, who said, you've got community building tools in your archives. Every artifact has the potential of being a community space for people where they can share information, share memories, and add to the fund of knowledge that you already have about stuff. So let me stop there and just make sure that I'm all with you, because I'm close to the end of my time. Any more questions? Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about the dark side, the paranoid side, that everything on the internet is available to NASA, and the government can learn more about everybody?
Yeah, there's definitely a dark side of the internet that cuts in a whole ton of directions. You know, the technology is agnostic. It's great for community building, and so the light side, if you would have it, is emblematic of that rare cancer community that gets formed where it couldn't have existed in physical space because not many people share the same cancer in the same physical space, and absolutely is life transforming to the people who are participants in it. But it's a hangout for pedophiles, and it's a hangout for people. There's a tremendous amount of interesting scholarship about cutting communities with young girls who literally encourage each other to follow anorexia practices and bulimia and cutting and stuff like that. And one of the powers of communities, of course, is affirmation. Where once if you had not good tendencies baked into you, you sometimes had a hard time finding affirmation in your world for the bad stuff that you were thinking about doing or the bad stuff that you might act out on. Well, now there are plenty of ways for all those people to find lots of support. I mean, I don't know that it's documented in data, but it's certainly an absolute article of faith in the national defense community, is that the internet is an incredibly powerful tool for terrorist recruiting. And that every time there's a dramatic event, oftentimes now the jihadists are taking pictures of it and then post the pictures on their websites and sometimes even YouTube, and it's a wonderful way to recruit other people to the cause. And so there's absolutely that. In a less sort of severe sense, there's still the problem of that Andrew Keen talks about, of any old knucklehead looking legitimate and credible and recruiting a bunch of followers with a bunch of testimonials or a bunch of arguments, and there's tons of ways that people could believe the wrong stuff or buy into agendas that weren't legitimate, and the internet is absolutely enabling that in ways that prior technologies weren't nearly as powerful at doing. Then there's the privacy stuff, and at one level, the Americans classically worry about Big Brother and big commercial brother being able to manipulate people and profile people and to make them do their will because they know a lot about people. The brand new thing that has been created in this environment is not surveillance, though. I mean, surveillance has new sort of forms in this era, which are important to be thinking about and acting on. But it's also the capacity of the crowd to watch each other. It's surveillance. It's from underneath. It's grassroots surveillance where we can all be watching each other. And, it might not be fun for Michael Edson that I can walk down the street and see him from far away and take his picture in Android and know that when we're within 3 feet of each other, not only who he is, but what he's done with his life and what his relationship status is and where he works and maybe even what he makes if he's on the public payroll and stuff like that. There's just a tremendous amount of ways that the existing databases that used to be hard to access, but you could get them, now are just out there for the taking. I mean, there was some transaction costs that if I cared about my neighbor's house and what my neighbor's mortgage was and whether the state of his divorce proceedings or something like that, I had to go somewhere to find that, and I had to invest a lot more time and effort to do that. Now, it's a couple of clicks away under the right circumstances. And so there's a tremendous amount of social challenge and renorming, really, that has to go into this stuff. I mean, my staff and I have this, I'm the old fogey by miles on this stuff. And I have said in the era of social media, we've actually had a long-term bet on this, I said, but in 10 to 15 years, a major nominee for a major judicial position, maybe Supreme Court or maybe Appeals Court or something like that, is going to go down in flames for the stuff that she posted on her Facebook pictures when she was in college. And my staff says, you're out of your mind, because we will have already calibrated that into our social expectations. And people who are jerks or did jerky things when they were young whippersnappers in college will be forgiven all that because we'll have a richer picture of who they are, and we will already sort of accounted for some of the knuckleheads, the things that they do. And when we asked experts about this, is this 20 years, is this going to be a more tolerant or less forgiving world and stuff? Absolute dead split down the middle. There were those who said, yes, we will become more, forgiving of each other's mistakes, and it'll be a better place. People say, no, human nature is what it is. We are going to abuse each other, and it's a world now of mutually assured humiliation, and we're all going to play that card at one time in our life when we have the capacity to do it. So have I covered many of the dark side parts of it? Yeah, there are. Although it's hard to get people to talk about this, and it's certainly hard to fact check people. We do a lot of national phone surveys. That's the data I was giving to you. And you can't ask people about this stuff on the phone. But we do ask one question that gives me some mild level hope, at least in a sort of fundamental area of impact. We ask the people we've identified as healthcare seekers online, have you or someone you've known been dramatically helped by the information you found online? The number's been going up since 2000. Now it's at 34%. Of the internet users say, absolutely, it's been really important in my life or somebody that I know. We ask this, the same question, have you or anybody else you know been severely damaged by what you found online? 3%, and it's been a steady number from the first time we asked it. So the good stuff is, the good outcomes are at least self-reported in a better way than the bad outcomes, and the good stuff is getting better over time, and the bad stuff is sort of staying level. And I think that's partly a testament to this networking strategy that I think a lot of people use. And it's partly a testament to, for better or for worse, we've gotten over the millennia, we've got these horse sense tests of what to believe and what not to believe. And even in this new environment, those horse sense tests are not really hurting us that much. Yep, there are people who believe misinformation. The most sort of obvious example is about a fifth of voters last election thought Barack Obama was a Muslim. And it's absolutely stayed steady through the course of the entire election. So these are not trivial things, and they're not, there's just more stuff in more ways that more people access that is not good. But it's not, so that's my dark side story. Yeah?
When you were talking about the photograph, it reminded me of the Red Balloon Project.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you know anything about the Red Balloon Project or not.
The Red Balloon Project is, help me with it. Did somebody release some balloons?
They actually installed 10 balloons across the country in different places that can easily be seen from a road. And their project was to identify the location of these red balloons. And a team from MIT actually was able to find out within 24 hours where these red balloons
Right. And it's sort of the modern, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the spirit of this inquiry was to test the small world notion. Could crowdsourcing in this environment where lots more people could share lots more information in lots more ways, was the pathway to that information relatively short? And there are tons of studies, experimental studies on the internet that show exactly that sort of match those famous pieces of work that Stanley Milgram from Columbia did in the 1960s about how the pathways that information has, and he was the guy that sort of coined the notion of 6 degrees of separation. All of us are more or less, 6 clicks from each other. And the internet is actually fewer numbers based on some of the research. One more question? Yeah.
Actually, as a follow-up to the dark side, I was wondering if you have a view on Facebook's latest change on its privacy settings. And from there, if you see practices emerging that in this sort of network theme that will help us protect ourselves from, I'm not so much worried about pedophiles perhaps in my own case, but companies mining our data and using that privacy.
Yeah, the question is about the changes that were announced this week on Facebook, and what did I think of them in general practices about protecting data and stuff like that. What Facebook did this week is allow people to more directly intervene in people's sessions on Facebook to say, are your privacy settings where you want them to be? And there are more alternatives now for people to sort of segment who learns what about them and who is notified when certain things change on their site. And Facebook is much more in their face about that, rather than making it an opt-out situation that is relatively difficult to navigate to. In other words, to segment your networks and to be more private. In the old system, you had to take a bunch of affirmative steps. Now, Facebook is sort of saying right away, is this what you want? And marching you through some of the protocols of that. What I think about that is that generally the online social networking environment is trying to move pretty dramatically in the direction of the way human social networks work. We don't want the 700 people who are friends of us to know everything about us, right? The way we operate in our social networks in the real world is to piece our data out, and you're on a need-to-know basis, basically, and stuff like that. And so this is a way for the technical environment of social networking to map much more closely with the way that we sort of naturally work with our social networks in real life and stuff like that. The tension in Facebook's life is, and now all these sites' lives, is they know so much about us. They really know who we deal with. They really know if they can map it with our purchases. They can figure out what's going on, but they certainly can figure out what movies we've recommended or recently seen, what books we've recommended, what college professors and kids have taken and stuff like that. There's just an enormous temptation in that world to exploit that data in the context of ads, to either sell it directly to advertisers or promise advertisers that I can get you right there in the line of sight of somebody that really cares about stuff that you have already declared that you like. And so that's why Facebook has had these series of hits and misses with behavioral advertising, where they've tried to render up ads that are more tied to the social networking data that they've collected, and sometimes Facebook folks have deeply rebelled about that, and so they've had to pull back and scale back on that. I think they're just trying to, they're heading into an environment where they're still trying to do that, but they're setting up a lot more of a foundation now to say, we want you to exercise the control over your data that you really want. We don't want to mess with stuff. We don't want to assume too much. We want you to be more declarative about it. That should be it. I'm going to stick around a little more if anybody has questions, but thank you so much for being a wonderful audience for me and Pew Internet. Thanks.